Thanks. Okay, might as well do it on a big scale.
Good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen. Welcome to the Globalization Center. The Asia program is very pleased today to host a book launch for Professor Gilbert Rozman's new volume, Northeast Asia's Stunted Regionalism, Bilateral Distrust in the Shadow of Globalization. This book was released by Cambridge University Press just 1 week ago, but it is ready for sale outside of this room. For those people who have to leave earlier, please feel free to take a look of the book. If not buy the book is ready now. Let me give a brief introduction of our distinguished speaker. Since his bio information is on a sheet, we are distributed. Gilbert Rozman is Musgrave Professor of Sociology at Princeton University, where he has taught since 1970. He was a Woodrow Wilson Center Fellow from 1996 to 1997, focusing on the subject of regionalism in Northeast Asia. Professor Rozman has published 14 books on China, Russia, or Japan. He received his PhD from Princeton University. Before we start today's book launch, let me make a quick announcement. And on July 21st, we will host a seminar on Taiwan's constitutional reform, and one of the speakers will be one cabinet member in the Taiwanese government. If nothing unexpected happens at the time, he will come. And please save your date and time for the event. Again, the event will be on July 21st from 3:30 to 5:30. Now let's start today's book launch. Professor Rozman, the microphone is yours.
Thank you very much, Ganglin. I'm honored to be here and to have a chance to bring to completion a project I've worked on for more than 10 years and worked on intensely while I spent a year here at the Wilson Center. The project has kept expanding. Both because events overtake it and because I've realized that the dimensions of understanding Northeast Asia are grander than I had anticipated. I've always wanted to look at countries in combination, beginning with studies of China and Russia as an undergraduate, and then a dissertation on China and Japan, and continuing with interest in how to work with these three countries. But only with the end of the Cold War did really new possibilities open up. And I began to see at the start of the 1990s how each of these countries was eyeing not just bilateral relations, but regional relations. And of course, the EU is in the back of everybody's minds. Can Northeast Asia achieve some kind of integration? No one is expecting anything of the scale of the EU, but something that changes the course of the way they deal with each other and creates an entity that begins to exert an influence on a global scale. And so one of the questions that immediately arises is, what are the countries and the parts of countries that really matter when you're talking about Northeast Asia? Now, some people use the term East Asian community. It includes Southeast Asia. I'm not going to do that, although in the ASEAN plus 3 grouping that has emerged since the late 1990s, there is a meeting of China, Japan, and South Korea with the Southeast Asian 10 countries. But I don't think that has a potential for coming together the way Northeast Asia, a smaller entity, does. And here I'm convinced that the Russian Far East, and Russia to a degree, plays a continuing role, that North Korea is brought in some way as a process that begins with the resolution of the nuclear crisis, and that the United States continues to matter. So we really have six countries. And so my view of Northeast Asia is China, Japan, and South Korea at the core, and the other units all being part of the process, the United States not being part of any kind of formal organization that might emerge. When one looks at the last years, though, and how Northeast Asia has evolved, what becomes apparent is that bilateral relations are the dominant process. First, they have to work out their partnerships, their competition with each other, and then they can build on a larger scale. But the bilateral relationships occur in the context, one of globalization and the much broader notion of what's happening within the world, and the notion that if you're going to have a region these days, it has to be promising, it has to link up with globalization. And on the other hand, these bilateral tensions place limits on what kind of region can operate. There is then a kind of sandwich effect where the region has to operate within, and each country has a strategy for building regionalism which changes over time. What I found was that the hopes usually conflicted with each other. And so that if at any period you look at the strategies, you see, well, that's not feasible because it contradicts what other countries' strategies are. They have different objectives and they're not going to get to their results. So no wonder I use the word stunted regionalism. It hasn't gone forward the way it's been intended. I call this largely a process of failure over the last 15 years. But it's a failure that keeps giving rise to new hopes. And as we see the dynamics period by period over these years and the rapid change in what is the central problem and what are the objectives of each of the countries and their strategies towards regionalism, we see the potential for a greater bond of integration emerging. Regionalism keeps coming back. The momentum keeps gathering despite the persistence of problems. So I don't draw a conclusion at the end of 15 years that we're on the verge of some kind of major region that's going to reshape the world, but rather that this is going to be a difficult process, and that if countries learn the lessons of the mistakes and the conflicts and contradictions that occurred over these previous years, there is every reason to assume they will be able to make greater progress. And I suggest that by 2015, a conservative view of 10 more years of groping and advances, we will have gone past the breakthrough, and this region will be over the threshold and on its way. I want to review the 6 periods I identify from the end of the 80s through 2003 and give some hints based on what thoughts I've had since the book was sent to the publisher about the potential for another period but not a breakthrough in the this year and the next year or two. The first period I see is when the idea for this region takes root. And it really starts in the late 80s as the Cold War is winding down, and it's made possible by the Soviet Union relaxing its grip on the polarized world, on the Cold War, and negotiating with a flexible U.S. administration that gave encouragement to Mikhail Gorbachev that he could integrate his country not only into the European community, which was his primary focus, but also into the Asia-Pacific region, which became an important theme for him in speeches in Vladivostok in 1986 and in Krasnoyarsk in 1988. So here was a leader saying, reversing previous Soviet policies, saying the Cold War is going, we're going to try to become part of this region, we're going to have a developmental approach to the Russian Far East that makes it part of the dynamic East Asian region, and that is the breakthrough. Very shortly thereafter, the Japanese local leaders and some central figures and think tanks began talking about the Sea of Japan Rim economic sphere and the possibility that Japan can start integrating the Russian Far East and now Northeast China, which is taking advantage of China's economic zones and new openness and reform, into some kind of larger framework. Japanese began using the term re-entering Asia, and the Japanese think tanks and academics are really the first in promoting ideas about regionalism. But soon the South Koreans are picking up some of the themes with their northern strategy, trying to sort of surround North Korea with economic ties and to create an atmosphere that's beckoning to the north. And China, particularly after Tiananmen, after their global position is more limited and they are faced with sanctions internationally, move towards a more regional approach. After their breakthrough with the Soviet Union and normalization in May of 1989, they're ready for more action. And so by the year 1990, we see a number of think tanks and journals forming on Northeast Asian regionalism inside China. So now we've got, by the beginning of the 1990s, momentum towards regionalism coming from many directions. We also have a kind of benign neglect from the United States at this time, encouraging Japan to be more open towards the Soviet Union. But what we find is when we go back and look at the Cold War logic, what countries supposedly thought was in their interest during the Cold War, that that wasn't all that was going on. Every country had a different strategy to Northeast Asia besides what the Cold War would have suggested. And these national aspirations in some way shifted them onto different courses. And this shaped the search for regionalism. Regionalism then began as a way to fulfill the national aspirations already present in the last stages of the Cold War for strengthening one's country's presence in the world and along its borders. And these aspirations sharply conflicted, and this kind of regionalism wasn't going to go very far, but that's how we see it beginning. Now, the second stage of regionalism takes root by 1991. It is mainly emerging from decentralization. In the battle between Yeltsin and Gorbachev, decentralization becomes the tool of Yeltsin, and local areas, so-called regions in the Russian Far East in particular, demand many new rights, control over resources, and even some separatist tendencies can be seen. We see in China the push towards more decentralization, and that accelerates in 1992 with Deng Xiaoping calling for market socialism and establishing new zones on the border of Russia and free economic zones and other kinds of new opportunities for the local areas to bypass the center in their contacts. And in Japan and South Korea, there's a wave of interest in decentralization and transferring power down. So this is a time then when the idea is at the central level they may not make such rapid progress in improving relations. After all, the Japanese Russian difference over the northern territories or the 4 disputed islands continues, and China doesn't really trust Yeltsin in his first year into an office when he's so Western-oriented, and South Korea still hasn't found a way to get through to North Korea. But everybody is looking at the border and trying to do something across their border that will really transform the way they get along with their neighbors. And this could be called border fever. It was intense. It was often spontaneous. Local governments frequently took the lead, and it was a huge failure. It became quickly criminalized. It led to more distrust. Lots of funds were stolen. Trust was not built up. And I call this cross-border distrust overcoming border fever. And by the beginning of 1994, this approach had reached its limits. In fact, the Sino-Russian border became so troubled and the Russian Far East so angered that they closed off some of the crossings, and they made it very difficult for Chinese to continue conducting trade, and there were places which lost 90% of their trade over a span of 1 year. So this is what happened in the second wave, I would say, of thinking and strategizing about regionalism. Japan is the lead country at this point. It is the country that has the strongest ideas about how to create regionalism, the most optimistic about what regionalism will bring, and yet its strategy for achieving regionalism doesn't take into account the psychology and the problems of neighbors and particularly of local governments across the borders. The Japanese are still expecting, even though their bubbly economy has just burst, they're still expecting a kind of vertical pattern of regionalism where they, the overwhelmingly dominant economy of the Northeast Asia, will be able to exercise a great deal of influence. China was weakened by sanctions and still not clearly emerged in its economic miracle. The Russian Far East was troubled and being cut off from Moscow because of new requirements for payments for energy and transportation. So it looked very promising for Japan, and they wanted to create their kind of region. They didn't succeed. The next phase of regionalism, which has to be investigated somewhat differently, I should say there's a different research style for each of these phases, different kinds of materials, not a lot in English on any of these periods of regionalism. The first, you really have to look at debates in the various languages on how the Cold War is ending or what to do with their neighboring countries. In the second, you go local newspapers and interviews on the borders are most productive, local journals in Northeast China. And the third phase, we're now talking about a period that's probably most easily overlooked. But I think it has to be part of the picture. And I call this an effort to build civilizational bridges. There's a strong ideological component. The theme of Asian values, which was most prominent in Southeast Asia, is also in evidence in Northeast Asia, but in different ways. I would say for China, this is an effort to reach out to Russia and to create a kind of distrust of the U.S., of the West, creating a kind of revival of a civilizational bond that has its roots in socialism, although wasn't called that. For some in Japan and some in China as well, China was developing more than one strategy, and South Korea in particular, because South Korea was at the peak of its economic gains and optimism, and Japan was beginning to lose some ground, and South Korea had hopes of continuing with very rapid growth. This was a time of pride in their society, their values, their ability to bring about the Asian century to come and overtake the West. So there were a lot of civilizational themes. There were conferences in Japan on creating the kanji cultural sphere. And in China, there was talk of Eastern civilization. China was identifying itself, now that socialism wasn't easily presented as an attractive value, as the new champion of Eastern civilization's success and dynamism, new confidence in China's economic miracle. So in the mid-90s, we see an effort to use these civilizational concepts as a way to establish some kind of integration within the region. But in fact, much more important than the reality of China, Korea, and Japan, all coming from 1,000 or more years of Confucian civilization and sharing much of their history until the late 19th century together. Much more important than that for the mid-1990s was the residue of Japan's half-century of historical expansion and occupation. And I would say it came more from Japan wanting to bring it up than the neighbors bringing it up. That in Japan, there is a sense that the only way to become normal is to reinterpret history and to deal with history in such a way that there no longer has to be an apology. And in fact, it can be presented to suggest that Japan was a normal country all along. And if it made mistakes, so did others, and they should be treated in the same vein as others' mistakes. So this was brought to the fore in 1995 at the 50th anniversary of the end of the occupations in the Pacific War, when the socialist leader of Japan, Murayama, in a coalition government, wanted to make a substantial apology and wanted a Diet resolution that brought some closure by highlighting Japan's apology and its willingness to address the past. And this was blocked, including by the LDP and by many local prefectures, which came up with different resolutions, which in some ways tried to justify or at least normalize the years of the war and really created new troubles, new historical distrust in South Korea, which played up the issue in the mid-90s, and China, which moved much more on the offense in criticizing Japan. So we have a kind of a breakdown of cultural trust to the extent that it had existed and had been moving in a different track at this time, quite the reverse of what was intended in with these themes of civilizational bridges. So that's where we are in the mid-90s after 3 stages of trying to achieve regionalism. Now, I have to say, all running through every period is extraordinary economic integration and investment, particularly in China. So although the Russian Far East often is troubled, you get South Korean ties with China, Japanese ties with China, continued South Korean ties with Japan, creating an economic momentum that should never be overlooked. And that is continuing, if not accelerating. So we're now over $250 billion in trade in Northeast Asia, huge amounts of investment going, especially to China, and that is on its way to reaching the proportions that would make it a very substantial rival economically of NAFTA and the EU. So this is moving forward. It's the idea that somehow you can go from there, from the economic integration through trade and investment, to a closer sense of a community and building something more substantial that addresses security, civilizational and political issues. That is the challenge that is always raised and never resolved. Okay, we move to 1996 through 98. The dates are often vary by a few months. And here we see a time when there was a new attention to security. China's becoming more assertive in pressing its views of regionalism. And the main theme that I discern in this phase is strategic partnerships. It starts with Yeltsin coming to China in April 1996, and China and Russia declaring a strategic partnership. Japan and the United States strengthened their alliance that same month, with the defense guidelines being agreed to. And shortly afterwards, Japan's initiative to Russia takes off, and we have soon the Krasnoyar summit, and Japan saying that it's going to have a breakthrough with Russia by the year 2000, and lots of optimism about a special relationship between these two countries. And even in the aftermath of the Taiwan missile crisis, there's an effort to create a strategic partnership between China and the United States, and Japan is rushing to catch up, although public opinion is quite nervous. So all through the region, we're seeing efforts to build bilateral ties with a security dimension, with a sense of creating some stability and some balance. And this is interpreted widely as balance of power, as great powers re-emerging in the world. And Primakov, the foreign minister of Russia before he becomes prime minister, is a kind of architect of this. And the Chinese, with their vocabulary emphasizing multipolarity and poles of the world balancing each other this is being part of the legacy of their strategic triangle thinking that was encouraged when Nixon visited China in 1972. All of this is lending itself to the idea that this is a time for powers to be maneuvering and dealing with the international environment in the post-Cold War era in this fashion. Well, all of this doesn't really address the serious security concerns in the region and the other problems in their strategies for regionalism, and it starts crashing down. We, in this country, think mostly of the United States and China, and the reticence on the part of some in the United States, particularly in the Congress, to accept a partnership with China that isn't really changing as much in non-economic ways as we would have liked. But really, we see within the region much of the dynamic played out of growing distrust. The breakdown of Sino-Japanese ties with the Jiangzemin summit in November 1998 in Japan, where the history issue reemerges in a big way. The failure of the Japanese-Russian initiative when Prime Minister Obuchi goes to Moscow in November 1998 and discovers that not only is Yeltsin too sick to really spend any time with him, but Russia is reversing its diplomatic approach of the previous year and a half and offering nothing to the Japanese. And you go right through the region and you see all of these partnerships are not are not getting anywhere. The Sino-Russian partnership is revealed to be quite empty. The Russians are not living up to the promises on the economy. And soon after the Kosovo War, Russia abandons China in its way of handling NATO. Yeltsin is not a reliable partner for China, and beyond. So there is a sense then that this is just one more period where the bilateral relationships start off in one direction and then reach an impasse, and the regional strategies are at a dead end, and this is not a way to move forward to long-term regionalism. And although the predominant voices of those who advocate regionalism and those within the region who are writing about this are that the economics will give rise to trust and to security solutions, and that soon there will be regionalism as long as the economics is going well, this is not borne out by what's really happening. The years when Sino-Japanese economic ties are most productive are often the years when the distrust advances most quickly. So here we are. Japan is becoming more hesitant about regionalism. It's fearful that China is gaining the advantage in the area. South Korea is now damaged by the Asian financial crisis, and the U.S. is riding high with the financial globalization, a new stage of globalization after the immediate post-Cold War democratic and human rights globalization that gave rise to a certain kind of triumphalism and confidence in the U.S. And Northeast Asia wasn't moving very quickly in any obvious way towards regionalism. But there was beginning to be some effects of the Asian financial crisis. There was a kind of backlash. Even Japan was becoming nervous, being too close to the United States. Much disappointment with the way the U.S. handled the financial crisis in Japan as well as in China and South Korea. The ASEAN +3 group was formed as the +3, China, Japan, Korea began meeting. Their summit was taking place as a breakfast meeting, and then it became a more formal meeting and an annual summit that was a more substantial occasion. So there was something happening to begin to bolster a sense of regional cooperation and regional separateness from the global community. Now, the new figure that begins to play a leading role is South Korea, led by Kim Dae-jung. Kim Dae-jung is all things to all sides. He is the champion of globalization, the champion of regionalism. He establishes a breakthrough in relations with Japan, although not nearly as much as the Japanese claimed. He restarted relations with Russia that had deteriorated, and of course is best known for his North Korean initiative. So in 1999-2000, Korea becomes the centerpiece in understanding what's going on with regionalism. And in this environment, I realized that I have to approach regionalism in a new way. And when I was at the Woodrow Wilson Center, I began to shift from looking at the localized relations to the great power relations. And then afterwards, before I could write up everything and complete the book, I realized I've got to start learning about Korea. So I took off, spent a semester in Korea, started learning Korean, and started working on Korea as a new indispensable component in understanding the process of regionalism. And this component has only grown, although it's changed its nature in the last few years. All along, it would have been obvious if Japan had had real Cold War logic or real regionalist logic for it to do everything it could to improve relations with South Korea. That is the natural gateway historically and in recent times to the region. And yet Japan hasn't done those things. although right now it emphasizes an FTA, creating its first free trade agreement in Asia with, apart from Singapore, with South Korea, and the negotiations are going on with the goal of completion next year. There still isn't a full realization of what to do with South Korea. And in fact, new textbooks in Japan that were already widely discussed at the end of the year 2000 greatly offended the South Korean people and helped bring a sharp downturn in the recent improvement in Japanese-South Korean relations. So in 1999-2000, we see South Korea reaching out to North Korea, Russia rapidly improving its relationship with North Korea under Putin, who has a more long-term, more strategic way of thinking about the issues. We see China strongly supporting the South Korean initiative and intensifying its support of regionalism, becoming the major advocate of regionalism in its broadest dimensions. South Korea also is a big advocate. And Japan nervously watching, saying it wants regionalism but not quite sure what the means to go forward with it would be. And really, in 2000, left behind by the initiatives, nervously watching the Sunshine Policy, not making a lot of progress in its own talks with North Korea, and not even confident of how the U.S. is handling either relations with China or relations with the Koreas. So this becomes the leading dynamic, then, watching the Sunshine Policy come and then unravel. Now, it's generally thought that the Sunshine Policy unravels because in the beginning of 2001, the Bush administration rejects it, or for a while isn't sure what it wants to do with it, is divided, and serves the same purposes as rejection. Now, that is much of the picture, but in fact, the Sunshine Policy, like some of the other previous approaches to regionalism, moves ahead of its time, tries to accomplish too much in too short a time through various devices, such as bribing North Korea to come to a summit when North Korea really isn't ready to do much of a reciprocal nature. There were so many problems with regionalism that had to be addressed that it's unlikely the Sunshine Policy could have directly moved the region forward. But nonetheless, there was a sense of progress in the year 2000 more than had occurred at any point in the previous 8 or 9 years from the time the idea sounded good before much had been done to try to implement it. And so there was a sense that the United States wasn't particularly standing in the way, and that the momentum was there. Everyone was in favor, and if they could just bring together a few elements and get some kind of breakthrough in one area, such as in dealing with North Korea, that would be sufficient. Well, we've seen after the security dilemmas overwhelmed the Sunshine Policy that we've been facing a new environment under the Bush administration. As usual, globalization is a driving force. Globalization has taken on a new dimension. Security has risen to the fore, both before 9/11 in the thinking of the Bush administration, and then especially afterwards. And the North Korean nuclear crisis, first the North Korean identity as part of the axis of evil, which helped divide the Bush administration from the rest of the region. Also the Bush administration's emphasis on Japan and trying to create a triangular, closer relationship with South Korea, Japan, and the United States, which never had realistic possibilities. And then in response to the nuclear crisis, trying to create a kind of coalition of 5 against 1. all of these were based on assumptions about this region which I think were at least partly wrong. And what the reasoning in each of these countries was about how to deal with North Korea, how to move forward as a group, where Japan's place was in the region, it turned out to be much more complex and much more difficult to bring about some combination. I wrote about the complications of the U.S. effort to sort of pull Japan further away from China and bring Japan closer together with South Korea in 2001, 2002. And I've also been writing about the geopolitics of the North Korean situation. But the implications for regionalism are discussed in the book. And here I see that the North Korean crisis has, on the one hand, brought 6 countries together in negotiations over security. And that's a big achievement. It creates a framework in Northeast Asia which will not easily be forgotten, of working together on serious security questions. And it's a framework that has, I think, worked in ways that were unexpected for the United States and has not been discussed in the ways it's actually been working forward. We've emphasized the coordination trilaterally with South Korea, Japan, and the United States. And I think that's been a sideshow that hasn't worked very well, although appearances have been kept. There's been other things going on. The increased coordination of China and Russia in dealing with this issue, although they have quite different strategies about the long-term role of North Korea and Northeast Asia. The confusion in Japan, the tension in Japan over drawing so close to the U.S., and now the significance of Koizumi's second visit to Pyongyang as the first visit, a step designed both to restart Japan's diplomacy in the region and to distance Japan somewhat from the United States. I see that, in other words, this nuclear crisis has important ramifications for the way Northeast Asia as a region will emerge. I won't dwell on this last and interesting period, but I think what I will do, in order not to prolong this presentation by me and leave a lot of time for questions, is I will draw up my lessons in the final chapter of the book for how to move regionalism forward that I arrived at following the review of these 6 periods in this effort to understand regionalism. First thing I would say is that both of the established paradigms in international relations studies, I don't think, do a very good job of understanding what's going on. The first paradigm, the realist school, suggests that countries are dealing with threats and trying to establish closer relations with other countries to counter those threats. I think if you try to figure out, every country in this region except South Korea is a threat to somebody else. And it's so confusing who is a threat to whom and how do you respond. I think when you add it up, there is no good realist explanation for what's going on in this region. I'll be glad to address that later. And it begins by the end of the Cold War. They already are moving quite far away from any realist explanations. China is usually seen as the country that's closest to realism, and maybe that's true. I think that probably is true, but even there I don't think it's a convincing explanation. And then the other explanation is a kind of economic, political economy approach that stresses you bring countries together economically, and other consequences flow from that. And that hasn't happened in this region. The spectacular economic results have not produced even substantial progress towards regional institutions, towards regional trust, towards overcoming the basic regional problems. So if those two approaches aren't working, where are we left? And international relations theories don't tell us very much, I would argue, where to go. I think we're talking about a combination of development strategies, national identities, network building relating to perceptions and trusts and bilateral relations. So there are a whole series of things, and for simplicity's sake, I call these a kind of sociological addition to the political economy and the realism. And what I will now draw are some conclusions that come from this review with these different perspectives. The first is Northeast Asian countries must do a better job of embracing globalization. If they want regionalism, I think all of them, including the United States, which doesn't always do its own good job, even though the U.S. is so closely identified with globalization, of accepting the consequences of globalization. That's step one. Second is the North Korean nuclear crisis must be used as an opportunity to draw these countries together. They really have a lot in common in what they think the outcome should be, apart from the United States, which sometimes talks about regime change and often seems to think that punishing North Korea for the kind of system it is a high priority, along with the highest priorities for so many of making sure those nuclear weapons are not developed and are dismantled, even if there may be some ambiguity in process here. So a kind of united approach to deal with the security issues, the most important security issues of the region, early rather than waiting for the economic problems to be solved. Accepting the fact that South Korea will be the central actor, organizing a multilateral approach to addressing the integration and the containment, if you will, of North Korea in dealing with this. A third conclusion I arrive at is to accept that China and Japan will be joint leaders of this region and work hard to create balance between the two. Right now, last year I had optimism that China was coming to that conclusion with the new thinking that was popular in Chinese writings about Japan and the very strong advocacy of regionalism that was coming from China and their theme of peaceful rising and how China was going to, through benevolence and reassurance, transform the attitudes of its neighbors. This recent visit to China, I came back 2 weeks ago, makes me less optimistic. China is getting much tougher towards Japan, much more critical of Japan's aspirations, not just to become a military great power, but also a political great power. I think that this Chinese recognition of Japan's need to establish itself as an equal leader in this region and have the balance to make this possible is still somewhat lacking. But Japan in particular needs to re-embrace the regional cause and accept the fact that China's economic growth guarantees it a position that Japan wasn't prepared for just 10 years ago. Beyond that, a breakthrough between Japan and Russia seems quite essential here, including bringing Russia in as an energy power with large energy projects and Russian support on security issues, and here some way of bypassing or compromising on the territorial issue, following the momentum that was achieved and then rejected within Japan in 2001 seems to me the obvious way to go. And there is already much stronger Japanese support for the energy initiative, but it's mainly coming in sort of outwitting China, defeating China, rather than as a way of building regional coordination. Right now it's being seen as a kind of battle between China and Japan. And my fear in the next stage, as I saw what is happening this year, is that the next stage will be a more open competition, conflict even between Japan and China as the major problem that inhibits the move towards regionalism. And so I would say Japan has to do a number of things before it really feels confident to address a rising China in the ways that may be essential for regionalism. And one of those things, I think, is to solidify ties with Russia, as well as to improve, develop its own breakthrough towards North Korea as the nuclear crisis is resolved, assuming it is. I would, just not to go through all of these lessons that I list in the final chapter, just to wrap things up then, I would suggest that we are looking ahead to some kind of breakthrough summit where there's a sense that regionalism is becoming a theme and even an identity with a vision. There's already a vision group at work led by Zhang Yunling, the director of the Institute of the Asia Pacific under the Chinese Academy of Social Sciences, with partners in South Korea and Japan above all. They are meeting in coordination with the ASEAN +3. So they're trying to work up vision statements and plans for regionalism. There is movement, but I think much more is needed. I think the North Korean crisis has to be resolved before this kind of movement forward can take place. There has to be a decision about what are the limits of U.S. unilateralism and what is the balance of Japan's relations between the United States and the Asian continent. I would also suggest that South Korea will continue to play a leading role following President Roh Moo-hyun's theme of South Korea becoming the Northeast Asian hub. And finally, I think there has to be some movement on the territorial issues, which symbolically have seemed to undermine the progress towards regionalism. I get the impression right now in China that their three-island dispute with Russia, which could be more serious than the Japanese islands, I think strategically the Russians are more concerned about their islands than Japan is concerned about its islands, its 4 islands. But that the Chinese are more willing to compromise with Japan, with Russia on the remaining islands than the Japanese are willing to compromise with Russia. Chinese have shown in 1989 how much their great power politics and their foreign policy in general advances through compromise, and I think they're prepared for another major compromise. But it's compromise. It's not giving in, and Russia will have to be prepared to do something in return. And I think so. Some progress on territorial issues, including between Japan and South Korea, their territorial dispute heated up a little in February of this year. Some progress on Taiwan, which I don't treat as a core part of this Northeast Asia because it's further south, but it certainly shapes the atmosphere for everyone concerned. All of these things are essential before we can confidently say we've reached that threshold and we now have a Northeast Asian region. I don't mean that these problems have to be solved, that the very critical Taiwan issue will be solved, or even the North Korean reintegration issue will be solved. It's just that there'll be some way of moving forward that will give these countries confidence that they can turn their attention elsewhere. Well, now I'll be happy to address your questions.
Thank you. Now we will open the floor for discussion, and please identify yourself and wait for the microphone. Over there.
My name is Tamotsu Nakano, and Beijing Fellow of George Washington University. 1 decade ago, I met Professor Rozman when I was working in the Niigata economic research for an arena. And I really impressed by what you said. It's excellent. Before Second World War, Japan tried to build Greater East Asian co-prosperity space. After Cold War, Japanese local government like Niigata, Tottori is making effort to establish Japan Shrimp corporations. But the Japanese central government is keen to develop missile defense with the United States. My idea is that without instead of using a hard power, military power, it's better to use a soft power like a Japanese local government is making progress. After working in Niigata, I came to Brookings and now George Washington. We prepared the grand design for prosperity and stability of Northeast Asia. This, the vision is we try to draw the big picture, big dream in Northeast Asia. For example, natural gas pipeline project, probably you mentioned of Russia, Mongolia, and also before Second War, Japan tried to build the Manchuria railways. And we tried to integrate natural gas pipeline and road network, telecommunication network in this region. It will cost about $10 billion per year. Next 20 years, we like to, involve in that kind of activity. As you mentioned, this, structure is like a balance of security structure in this region. Instead of going to the collective security with the military power, it's better to create cooperative securities on the basis of economic cooperations. This is our vision. Japanese government, must involve these directions instead of encouraging military balance or missile defense. Thank you very much.
Nagano-san, thank you. And I remember meeting you, and your institute, IRINA, is one of, if not the leading local think tank for looking forward to how regional integration can take place. I find, though, the emphasis on soft power, while necessary and moving things forward, runs up against some hard realities, and that the security issues are genuine. They're not just artificial, and that the Japanese government has reason to be concerned about how to face the North Korean nuclear issue, how to face the rise of the Chinese military, how to build a security framework that corresponds to these wonderful plans for energy and pipelines and so on. There also is the criminal reality. My sense is that looking from Niigata, you see criminalized borders all along. One of the things I was working on at the Wilson Center was the criminalization of the cross-border trade and not just the sort of uncivilized nature, even when it wasn't corruption and payoffs and the trade mainly going in through criminal organizations and not being reported to local governments, like the crab trade, the lumber trade, the fish trade. Much of that dealing with Russia and even across the Chinese border has been criminalized, and organized crime inside Japan and inside South Korea is deeply involved in much of this. That has to be addressed by these centers, and many of these centers just propose nice projects that sound good when what they're facing is an environment in the Russian Far East that's still stripping assets from foreign investors. Most recently, the complications of Sakhalin-3 oil and gas project, which would be part, I think, of the pipeline project that you're talking about. It looks like the Exxon Mobil and so on investment in that project may be stripped away, even though it's upwards of $600–700 million by the Russian courts. And so it's not guaranteed. And that's all happened this year after so many years of progress. And that still reflects the nature of the troubles in this region that will have to be overcome. And I think that one of the problems with the local governments is that they don't necessarily appreciate the market forces that come from the big cities that on the borders, particularly the Russian Far East and Northeast China, market forces are very weak. State-owned enterprises, criminal organizations linked to local administrations. Even Hokkaido had been weak in terms of its potential cooperation through market economic forces, and have been too tolerant of these criminal activities. So I would say that's why I think we have a long way to go, and that soft power, however important, still needs to be balanced with hard power.
Bob, Hathaway here at the Wilson Center. Gil, it's
someone who works here, take particular pride in seeing the result of a fellowship we gave you some years ago. I wasn't here then, so I had nothing to do with that. But nonetheless, we bask in the reflected glory, and just based on what I've heard today, it was certainly a sound investment on the part of the Wilson Center, and we congratulate you. I'm sorry you didn't stop your comments 60 seconds earlier than you did, because I wanted to ask you a Taiwan question. And I'm going to put it on the table anyway, but I take your point that you really didn't deal much with Taiwan because of its geography to the south. The question I had planned to ask you was, you spent a lot of time talking about one of the two potential flashpoints in Asia, that being North Korea nuclear problem. And I was curious as to your views on if tensions in the Taiwan Strait escalate, either short of armed conflict or even to the point of armed conflict. What do you think the impact of that would be on this movement toward regional integration of one sort or another? You suggested, for instance, when talking about North Korea, that North Korea nuclear problem might actually serve to bring the other Asian powers, if not necessarily the United States, together. I'm curious as to whether that would also be the case in the eventuality of increased tensions in the Taiwan Strait. That was my question. If you would prefer not to go there, then I will ask you a second different question. You can take your choice. And that is the role of the United States here. You started out by saying that, yes, the United States was clearly one of the key actors, albeit geographically somewhat removed from the region. But then I heard relatively little about the United States in your subsequent comments. As I said just a second ago, you suggested that, in fact, North Korea nuclear problem might work to bring the Asian powers together, but not necessarily the United States. To what extent will the United States be an active and cooperative partner in this increased regional process? To what extent will the Asian members find that they need to or want to work more closely together, in part at least, to counterbalance United States power?
Well, they are two terrific questions, and one cannot help think about these all the time in dealing with this region. I will try. I can't resist saying something about both, although I won't give you as extensive answers as I should, and I wish I could do well. On the first question, I think a lot depends on between the United States and China on whether we can limit the tensions over Taiwan. I think there's potential to do so on both sides, but I don't find either addressing it sufficiently. I think China has become more exercised about Taiwan than it needed to be in the last few months, and that happened in 1995 when the visit of Li Denghui occurred to the United States, and I think that those overreactions could be quite problematic. There is a real potential in Taiwan for a downward spin. The terms economic sanctions is beginning to be used now. We really have the potential of if China is quite impatient, or if the U.S. accelerates ties and support for Taiwan that work together with the Taiwan independence move, we really have a problem that could interrupt everything in this region for a period of time and damage everything else. So I fear this. I think that the main tendency on the part of most U.S. governments and part at least of the Chinese government is to prevent that from happening. And last year I would have said the odds were in favor of that coming from China, but now I'm not as certain. So, but I also would say we should bring Japan into the picture. I now think that Japan is becoming a huge actor on the Taiwan situation, caring about the fate of Taiwan no less than the United States, and perhaps taking a position that will become no less offensive to China. And how China deals with Japan is becoming more significant here, too. It's not just the United States, it's also Japan. Now, on the question of a counterweight or a cooperative active partner of the U.S. In this emerging region, I would say the tensions in this region for some time to come make it likely that it's more cooperative active partner, that the potential for creating a counterweight is distant. But it also depends on U.S. policy. The U.S. has, for the last year and a half, not given any hope to the countries of Northeast Asia for resolving the nuclear crisis. Until yesterday, there was no serious plan on the table, and I'm not sure yet whether yesterday's plan passes some kind of threshold. And one by one, they got more nervous about the U.S. China, in December of last year, big change in the Chinese nervousness in June of this year from October of last year. Much more nervous about the U.S. not doing enough. Japan, now we see, is getting nervous too. And so they're the last. Now everyone's nervous about the U.S. If the U.S. does things like that and makes everyone nervous, then the counterbalancing force picks up. I think that the U.S. cannot treat regionalism in Northeast Asia as something we can block. It won't work. Although maybe in the short run it will, like this nuclear crisis in a sense blocks it, but it's not a long-term way to deal with it. I think it's something we can manage, we can steer, if we accept it in essence, and then try to figure out how we can work with this process. It'll be a lot better, the outcome. So that's my sense. It's within our power to help determine whether it is a counterweight or a partner.
Lady over there. Next.
Ayako Doi with the Japan Digest. Good to hear your comment. At the outset, you rather confidently said that by 2015, regionalism will be up and going. And then you went on to enumerate all the negatives that are going on. The analysis of which I agree mostly. Those are, sometimes insurmountable. It looks insurmountable. Bilateral animosity, mistrust, rivalry, all those things. And so, my sense, even before I came here today, is that in the next, decade or two, what will happen is that this region will hobble along trying to get over or deal with the crisis that comes one after another, and just try to manage not to have open conflicts rather than having active regionalism going. I do remember the days and years when there were high hopes about the regionalism not long time ago. In the last 15 years, there are several. It seems to me, or I fear, that those days of hope of regionalism have come and gone. What makes you think so optimistic that by 2015 there will be a regionalism thriving as an idea?
Well, thank you, and it's good to see you again. The book is largely pessimistic. There are 6 chapters. In each period, things went wrong. And we now are in the North Korean nuclear crisis, and things are on hold. From the point of view of Japan, I see right now the greatest pessimism. So I think what you just said reflects the state of discussion in Japan on regionalism. From the point of view of South Korea, China, Russia to a new degree, I think things are changing, and that there is a sense that they need to stabilize some of the issues, and some big projects need to go forward, and that the current situation, just like each of the situations in the last 15 years, is not long-lived. We've gone through 2 or 3 year periods where there's been one kind of momentum and then it's shifted quite abruptly, and I don't see why that's going to not continue. That when the current situation, which is particularly pessimistic because of the North Korean problem and the rising Japanese distrust of China, is not a sign that we're about to get there. So I see so many forces in favor of resolving certain basic problems, or at least damping them down so that they aren't blocking the path forward. After all, the Japanese economy in the last 4 years has become integrated with China's economy in an unprecedented degree. Just about every major Japanese company has gone into China in a big way. Can you imagine that going on indefinitely while China and Japan have high degrees of tension? That seems to me improbable. There's going to be some ways to try to stabilize things. Probably not until Japan has a new constitution, not until China has a new reality about Japan's rising political power and military activity, not until Japan has a new reality about China, and so on. There are a series of things. Also, when I say it's going to pass a threshold of regionalism, I'm not talking about EU regionalism. I'm talking about a kind of regionalism that doesn't overcome continued troubles and rivalries. There's going to be a regional organization. There's going to be a regional vision. There's going to be a sense of the future and some stabilization in dealing with some of the problems of the past and some of the security issues. That doesn't mean we're going to have a region that isn't going to have lots of flare-ups of the sort you probably are thinking of. So I'm not suggesting some kind of utopia ahead. We're still going to have trouble. I'm just saying there's going to be a sense this region has to exist. Everybody needs it in the region. And we can't live with a North Korean nuclear crisis or a Taiwan missile crisis every 2 or 3 years, given the high level of economic integration that's occurring.
Dr. Yang in the front.
Dacheng Yang, George Washington University. I enjoy your talk very much.
Thank you.
I think you're one of the rare person who has all the language, linguistic, and country background to look at from all sides. 2 of my questions have been more or less addressed in your remarks. The first deals with what is regionalism. I'm sure you're getting into that in your book. And I mean, how do you measure regional integration? Is that primarily economic or driven by institutions? And what role is popular culture? It's something you probably could maybe illuminate a little bit. For example, the period you talk about the Japan-South Korean tension, and which is followed by the World Cup and the increasing cultural interpenetration, popular culture. Even between Japan and China, last year China unilaterally gave the Japanese citizens no visa travel to China up to 15 days. So, and you alluded to the network as another dimension. I wonder if you can elaborate a little bit. And the second question, again, is being addressed is, how do you make sense of this Japan-China dynamic? What are the factors we should be watching? The rising, popular anti-Japanese sentiment in China, to what extent that is influence on the government. I mean, from the Japanese point of view, China is just still one-party dictatorship, and how can you reach accommodation with such a country? And from Chinese point of view, of course, you have this close U.S.-Japan alliance. How can you reach accommodation?
Well, I appreciate your questions, and I know your interest in popular culture is there. And I'm really glad you brought that up, because I think that's one of the ways in which there's integration beyond the economics that people don't appreciate. it involves cultural groups, Korean crazes in Japan, mass travel from Japan to South Korea, mass travel from Japan to China. There is a kind of schooling. Korean #1 foreign students in China are Koreans, and there are more and more of them, and on and on. There is some kind of networking going on here that is very important. I define regionalism in a way that is intended to say when a kind of breakthrough might achieve. There's got to be an established organization. There has to be a vision of what the region is trying to achieve. They have to accept and build on the momentum of their economic integration. So I won't belabor that, because I really find your third point the most interesting for reflecting on my own work, and that is what is the real dynamic in the Sino-Japanese relationship. And here I would say, I think on the Japanese side, there not only has been an economic stagnation resulting from the collapse of the bubble economy and the loss of the old developmental state model, and there's been a political failure in that the political leadership hasn't been up to addressing the problems of the state, as particularly discussed in 1993 and around then. But I'd say there's been a foreign policy frustration, that Japan had high hopes for its foreign policy, for re-entering Asia, for becoming more equal to the United States and world alliances, and that the end of the Cold War brought foreign policy that was quite unexpected and disappointing to the Japanese. I think there's also the struggle of not having dealt with the history of contemporary history of Japan since 1945, really not having faced these issues. And that's giving rise to a search for something inside Japan that I think tells us more about Japan than it does even about China. But in addition to that, China hasn't done some of the things to build trust with Japan. It's made some critical mistakes. I've written an article as part of the series of various articles that are the foundation for the book. And in one of these articles, I review the Japanese debates on China from 1989 to about 2002, and another I review the Chinese debates on Japan. And I argue that in the late 80s, beginning of the 90s, Japan had an opportunity to reach Chinese public opinion and didn't use it. It was too confident. It thought China would be dependent economically and was weak, and that Japan could essentially ignore history and not worry about building trust. And I think this was a lost opportunity. It would have been a much wonderful time for Japan to use its strength to improve its relationship long-term with the Chinese people. I then think that in the mid-90s, for about 5 years, that China played the nationalist card. Some China specialists on Japan have told me that they thought the national policy went astray under Jiang Zemin, that he was too critical of Japan, and this was a shortcoming. And that in the last few years, until this year, I thought, again, it was Japan playing up the China threat. And China was trying to change, beginning with smile diplomacy towards Japan in 1999, but it was too late and the Japanese weren't reciprocating. I would say, though, that I think there's also a kind of power struggle going on here, a way of building national credentials. Koizumi is using nationalism as a way to strengthen his hold in the country. I think this is going on in every country. Putin is doing it. Bush is doing it. We're seeing this in one country after another. Roh Moo-hyun used anti-Americanism and nationalism. And right now I think a particular place to watch is China, where I see Jiang Zemin trying to play to keep his place in power, using the Hong Kong democracy movement and the Taiwan independence movement as ways to insist on a tougher Chinese foreign policy. And this also means toughness towards Japan, which I think will only set back China's main goals in this region. It's contradictory to the objectives of last year, and it seems to me short-lived based on narrow political calculations.
Gentleman on the right, this will be the last question.
Thank you very much for your wonderful presentation, Professor Rozman. My name is Gonzalo Paz. I came from South America, and I have been studying regional integration in the Americas. and comparing this with what was like in Asia until very recently, but also studying the links, the Trans-Pacific links. And just coming from the APEC Study Center meeting in Chile, and the region that people studying APEC have in mind is a totally different kind of region, and also these people see this region, the APEC region, in crisis, and they mention the Asian crisis of 1997 as one cause, the failure of the Doha round of negotiations also being a motive. But there have been a new kind of Trans-Pacific initiative as the free trade area between South Korea and Chile. Japan and Mexico are also negotiating such a process of economic integration at least. So we can see a lot of movement in regionalism in East Asia, but also new developments in trans-regionalism, if you prefer to call. So I would like to hear a comment about these new developments and about the different meaning of regionalism, integration, and community. I remember President Clinton mentioned community building in Seattle. What happened with this? Is APEC dead or not?
There are a number of units from sub-regions to inter-regions, which fall below the global level. And in Northeast Asia, one has to sort out these different levels. I agree with your emphasis on the Seattle Summit in 1993, where the U.S. tried to steer Asian thoughts about regionalism towards the larger APEC community, create something that would emphasize U.S. values and particularly the open economies that we favor, worried about the continued elements of protectionism in some of the Asian economies. But I think the Asian financial crisis and other developments show that APEC is too large, too diverse to serve the purpose of a major region with political and security dimensions as we see in the EU and in NAFTA. And APEC still has a role, particularly for economic objectives. But I think it's not a very significant region as regions go. Now, ASEAN is often played up as a more significant region. ASEAN, in fact, is extraordinarily diverse in attitudes towards politics, towards human rights, towards security, tremendous distrust within the area. I don't think it can get very far in building real regionalism, although it has become the venue through ASEAN Plus 3 and through ARF talks dealing with security, regional forum talks, that has sort of brought in Northeast Asia in ways it didn't conveniently do itself. But I think that the real focus has to be the Northeast Asian 5 plus the U.S. as the units that are addressing the big issues that have the more extensive economic integration, where you can talk about real FTAs, where everyone is part of WTO except Russia, which wants to join soon, and North Korea, which can be bypassed until it's ready, that this is really the scene of four great powers interacting, a number of the world's great economies becoming more integrated, the rise of China confronting the power of the U.S. economy. There are big things going on in this area, and that's where I think the intense debates are centered inside each of the countries of the region, and those debates are what I've tried to capture.
Before I conclude today's meeting, I would like to encourage you to buy the book once more. And please join me to run a round of applause to Professor Rozman for his excellent presentation. Thank you for coming.
Thank you. 8:15, okay, and we'll just go right. Okay, I'll be ready, we'll be ready at 8:15. So this will be a breakfast meeting. She will go with me, yeah. Okay, and then we'll go, so 8:30 to 10 will be the meetings, and then 8:45 to 10, or a little after 10, and then I'm going to stay in the buildings and meet a couple congressmen at 11 and 11:30.
Your student contact us. She'll be there. She will take you to some.
Okay, very good. Yeah.
Yeah, thank you.
Good to see you again.
This I even Niigata, together with North
I remember you were about to move to. Yes, and you also had something to do with another. Besides Niigata, didn't you have something to do with
Tottori?
Tottori, exactly.
I mentioned Tottori. Yeah, I worked in Tottori.
I didn't go to Tottori, but you told me about
and
Tottori.
Nihon Koei is a Japanese consulting firm. And last year I prepared this one with Nira.
Oh, I missed this. I didn't know about
just
this.
for you. We prepared a Japanese version, and about 2 years ago, the published in Japanese became very popular, and recently just translated into English.
You are very kind.
And now I was looking.
Where are you going to be this year?
This year is George Washington is under Mike Mochizuki.
I hope we keep in touch.
September, I'm going to teach at
Okay, so we're not.
So
I hope you will come to Princeton sometime. And
do you, for example, are you going to stay tonight here?
yes, I am.
Tomorrow morning or something like? Do you think?
I have some meetings on tomorrow morning. All morning, I have
What
meetings.
time do you have?
But I'm going to be on Capitol Hill meeting with some congressional staff, and then I'm going to meet a couple of congressmen and get my books.
Today I give this book to the Kelly.
Oh, John Kerry.
John Kerry, and February,
Well, but I would be delighted. I come to Washington quite often.
Okay.
Once a month or so.
Oh, really?
So we can be in touch, so we can plan.
I return to Japan the middle of July and stay in Japan 1 month. I come back here end of August or maybe September sometimes.
Okay.
Yeah,
so we will meet sometime this fall. I look forward to that.
Your idea is wonderful.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Great.
Thank you very much.
Okay. Oh yes, I prospect for regional human rights mechanism. Let me give you my card so we can be in touch.